And the way people have read that novel has been in terms of Ishiguro's very kind of vocal opposition to what he saw as British insularity. As a kind of British migrant, he spoke against the Leave campaign. So people read the novel within that sort of framework. Other people, other medievalists who have looked at the role of Anglo-Saxonism within Brexit-era England have examined things like the mobilisation of Anglo-Saxon freedoms as a specifically English legacy in popular political writings. And I'm thinking here in particular of Matthias Berger at Bern, who has done some really interesting work on a political text by a sort of conservative British politician. And the book is a 2013 book called How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters. And the author of that is Daniel Hannam, who's a conservative British member of the European Parliament. So I'd commend Matthias's work on that. A team from University College London's Institute of Archaeology have all right. So a team from University College London's Institute of Archaeology have done big data analysis on how early medieval England was portrayed in Brexit-related Facebook posts between 2010 and 2017. So thinking also about screen texts, Anglo-Saxon texts within Brexit era, people like, again, Andrew Elliott, Christopher Jensen, Laurie Fink and Susan Aronstein have all examined screen and performance texts that have mined early medieval England in response to the cultural and political climate of the Brexit era. So, given the emergence over the last few years of several Brexit screen texts, the ones that I'm going to be talking about with Anglo-Saxonist content, it's worth looking at their various representations of early medieval or Saxon England to assess the extent to which they could be seen to express nationalist or racist sentiments, or indeed to reject those sentiments, to short circuit them and resist racist and nationalist representations. And so the anti-racist potential of medievalism is something that we do also need to be attentive to. I think there's been really fantastic work done on the racist potentials of medievalist discourse, but I think we also need to continue to look for those more hopeful examples of texts that resist that particular construal of the Middle Ages. Thinking in particular of a book that I think is going to be published tomorrow, Jonathan Shu's book, Anti-Racist Medievalisms, where he's looking at medievalisms produced by Black, Latinx, Indigenous and multiracial artists. I'm not going to be looking at texts like that. I'm going to be looking at texts that are very much produced out of British culture, but thinking about the possibilities within those texts to resist the, again, racist and nationalist implications of Anglo-Saxonism. And in particular, I'm going to be arguing that we see that in long form visual representations, televisual representations like Detectorists and The Last Kingdom. So start with The Last Kingdom. So The Last Kingdom began life as a BBC Two series. And then it became a Netflix series. So the first two seasons were on BBC Two, and then seasons 3 and 4 were on Netflix. And it's now a fifth season has just recently been greenlit, and I'm assuming is in production to also be screened on Netflix. And so it started in 2014, as I mentioned before, and its most recent seasons have been 2018 and 2020, respectively. So the content. So The Last Kingdom is a long-form television historical drama based on Bernard Cornwell's 13-book historical novel series, The Saxon Stories, which Cornwell began in 2004 and wrapped up just at the end of last year. So he wrote his final novel in that series last year. And so the novels themselves are in that more broadly construed definition of Brexit era as well. So they could potentially be put under that category of historical Brexit. But one of the things that's really interesting is that again, before the referendum, so some years before the referendum, the BBC approached the show's creator, Stephen Butchard, to adapt the novels into television, into a televisual form, right at the time when we're beginning to have that kind of acceleration of conversation about Britain leaving the EU. So it is very much kind of part of that sort of culture of considering England's relationship, its kind of national sovereignty and its relationship to Europe. So a little bit about the show for those who might not know it. It's been very popular, so many of you might already know a lot about this show, but for those who don't, the show follows the fortunes of Uhtred of Bebbanburg, who was Saxon-born, but was ousted from his inheritance and then kidnapped by a group of Vikings who now occupy the north of England. So when he is wrongly accused of killing his Viking family, he now belongs nowhere. So he's Saxon, identifies as Danish, but has nowhere that he belongs any longer. So he decides that his only chance of regaining his patrimony in Bebbanburg is to align himself with Alfred of Wessex. Over the next 3 seasons, until Alfred's death, we follow the fraught but deep and mutually respectful relationship between the two men, as the learned master strategist Alfred pursues his goal of a unified England, and Uhtred struggles between his divided allegiances between his Saxon heritage and his Danish pagan identity. Uhtred's struggle continues beyond Alfred's death, and that takes place early in season 3. As his alliances, and this is Uhtred's alliances, continue to fluctuate and shift between Saxon and Dane, and his quest to recover his status as the Earl of Bebbanburg is thwarted not so much by Vikings, although of course they remain a constant violent threat throughout the series, but also by the internecine politics within and between the Saxon kingdoms. So if I can move to my next slide. In terms of the question of the visual representation of the Middle Ages, The Last Kingdom uses basically an immersive, very physical world building. Those of you who are interested may already know that the film is actually, or the series is actually filmed in outside of Budapest. So it's not filmed in England, it's filmed at the Quarter Studios medieval set, which is much used by medieval films. The makers of this show very much accept the premise that it is possible to represent the Middle Ages with some degree of verisimilitude. And it works fairly unreflexively, I would say, on the assumption that people wish to see it recreated immersively. So that is the kind of the television show's commitment, is to immersive medieval verisimilitude, and very much in the heroic visual idiom that has characterized other shows like Game of Thrones and Vikings. As visual representation of the medieval past, this is very much in using the idiom that David Matthews has described as the Gothic Middle Ages. And so this is a violent, hypermasculine world. It's super hypermasculine, actually. And its sets are raw. They're kind of muddy exterior, lots and lots of exterior scenes that are kind of muddy and kind of crude. And again, that heightened verisimilitude extends very, very powerfully to its battle scenes. So these battle scenes are, again, very heightened, hyper-realist, lots of slow motion, particularly when there's blood spatter involved. And so there is this kind of, and extreme close-ups. So it's, on the one hand, there's verisimilitude. On the other hand, there's hyper-realism. And then when we have the interior scenes, we don't tend to have that kind of very heightened aesthetic. We tend to have a kind of much more sort of domestic, very sort of domestic, immersive sort of scenery. So that's the visual idiom to which the series commits itself, except when it comes to costumes. So in terms of the question of the costumes are an exception to the overall appearance of verisimilitude and kind of historical accuracy. The production team is open about the fact that that a number of the costumes are somewhat anachronistic by design. And one of the ones that are often I'll start again. The costumes of the character Brida are the ones that are singled out most often by the show's designers as deliberately anachronistic, and they describe Brida as looking like she could be a girl going to a dance party or to some sort of music festival in some sort of muddy field somewhere. And it's interesting because this is something that breaks with that sort of attempt at verisimilitude in the series, but also this costuming of Breda is a really, really common thing that happens in historical dramas, where the woman's body becomes the kind of semiotic bridge between the world of the story and the aesthetic and desiring sort of world of the audience. And so that's certainly the case with Breda. So moving on then, I want to talk a little bit about its the kind of ideological representation of the again Saxon England in the series. So the thing about this series, and I'll freely admit that when I started watching it, I had some expectations in my mind that I would find myself watching something that was very nationalistic, that was probably quite racist, that reified the idea of continuous Englishness, and kind of unified national sovereignty, etc. And I don't actually think that that's what I have experienced while watching the show, which was an interesting and kind of pleasant surprise to me. So it is tempting to see, because we know that it's going to be about the portrayal of Alfred the Great, that it's going to be, the story is going to be the quest to unify the Christian Saxon kingdoms, that, you know, this is what we're going to find. But what we find is, I think, a much more kind of complex world in this series. And what I want to say, because I know that the things that one of the concerns or one of the issues that you're looking at in this particular conference is thinking about modes of representation. What I really want to say is that I think long form television offers opportunities for subtlety and nuance and querying dominant ideologies. Because if you're looking at a series like this one that's something like 40 hours of television, I think it's quite hard in that long form to maintain a completely rigid ideological sort of depiction. And so I think it is actually quite complex. The series, the television show's creators have been quite upfront about the fact that they are engaging with Brexit with this show. And in particular, they nominate season 3 as what they call their Brexit season. So Stephen Butchard, again, the creator of the first 3 seasons of the show, has been open about that. And one of the things that I wanted to point to is the way in which they have, in some ways, kind of will certainly surprise me as a viewer by trying to think through the way in which they need to loosen up and offer a more complex portrayal of what this idea of a quest for unified England might have looked like. And so, as we know, Alfred the Great has had a long kind of life, certainly again since the 19th century, as a sort of a national hero and very much part of a kind of a Victorian cult of medieval nation making. But when we look at other parts of this season, particularly season 3, what we see is an attempt to, I suppose, if we're looking at the idea of this text as offering some sort of allegorical parallel to Brexit England, to Brexit Britain, then we see an attempt to actually think through the meaning of insularity and the meaning of hostility in a nation that is kind of pitting itself against an outside. So what I just want to point you to in particular is the character Thura in season 3. And so she's a Dane. Okay, so she's the daughter of Ragnar, who had adopted Uhtred, but she has married a Saxon priest, and so she's a woman now who's kind of occupying, like Uhtred, she's kind of occupying a place between two cultures. And in the 3rd season, what we see is her being subjected. She's in Winchester, and she's being subjected repeatedly to xenophobic abuse, harassment, and violence. And this builds to a really horrific conclusion where she's ultimately killed in a house fire. So she actually kills herself in order to not be burnt to death. And so we see her subjected to this harassment throughout the season. And so one of the things that we see is that if this show is looking at the politics of nation and thinking about also, again, questions of insularity, it's actually being much more kind of careful about nuancing what that's going to mean to an audience watching this show in the Brexit era. But one of the things that I've been trying to think through, and I have to say that I'm very much still thinking through a number of the ideas that I'm talking about here today, is that I've been wondering about what it means to basically use the show as a Brexit allegory, which again, the creators have said they are doing that in this season. What does it mean to basically dramatize racial violence using all white characters? So this show basically has, except for a handful of characters in the background in one section, it's all white. It's an all white cast. And so when we watch this kind of spectacle of racism in this season, what we see is a white woman being subjected to xenophobic attacks by white men. And I guess the question that I have is, and this is a genuine question that people out there who are listening might have some answers to for me, is the show, what is the show doing when it does this? Is it evading the question of how xenophobia and racism plays out in Brexit England, which is much more against non-white, against minorities like, say, South Asian populations, etc., and Islamic populations within England? Or is it attempting to use this white-on-white violence to, I suppose, make xenophobia and racism legible to an audience that's an assumed kind of white British audience? And so it's just a question that I have. I'm still trying to think through what it means to dramatise this in this particular season. So, so moving on. So thinking about the question of, I'm sorry, I'm just going to catch up with my notes in a second because I sort of went off my script. So, all right, so one of the things that's been interesting before I go on to my next point is that when I started reading reviews of the show to see what people made of it, and particularly looking at how people responded in the first season or so around the time of the referendum, what I found was, again, against my expectations, not many of the people, particularly the British reviewers, were reading the show as troubling or as reifying nation, etc. The only review that I found was a US one, but most of the British ones were not actually sort of looking at the show through that particular lens. So again, the question becomes then, the reviewers aren't reading the show as a Brexit allegory, and yet the show creators are actually suggesting that it is. And so where do we see it? If we are going to identify any kind of political allegory in the show, where do we identify it? And one of the things that I suppose I would say is that I think that if there is a kind of a parallel with Brexit, it lies in this relationship, this quite sort of complex, long-standing and quite volatile relationship between Uhtred and Alfred. So again, Alfred is the king who is attempting to unify the English kingdoms, the Saxon kingdoms, and we have Uhtred, who is this figure who is Saxon, but then has this strong affiliation with the Danes. And so what we see is this kind of protracted stalemate between the pair and this constant renegotiations and change of affiliation. And to me, if there's any kind of Brexit allegory in here, it is in this very chaotic narrative that we see of realpolitik, of these kinds of shifting and collapsing alliances. I mean, I'm assuming everybody else like me has been following the fallout from the Brexit referendum over many years, just watching one deal after another fall over and dissolve into nothing, and commencement of new deals. And so that kind of chaotic narrative that we see in this show, I think, is maybe one way we can think about it as having a sort of an allegorical resonance with Brexit. So I'm going to move on to my second show, which is, again, another television show, but quite different from the Last Kingdom. So I'm hoping this is a show that some of you have been able to see. The first two seasons of it, if you haven't watched it, it is such a good show. And the first two seasons are on Netflix. The third season is much harder to get. You can get it, but you have to sort of find it on YouTube and watch it. It's quite not a very good high quality recording of it. So I'm going to talk about Detectorist. So Detectorist is another long-form television series with 3 seasons that screened on BBC 4 between 2014 and 2017. It's written and directed by Mackenzie Crook, who also stars, and he's the figure on the right there, and he stars as Andy. This gentle comedy follows Andy, a metal detectorist who is studying for an archaeology degree, and his middle-aged metal detectorist friend Lance, who's probably the real hero of the show, in fact, as they search for the historical treasures in the fields around their small Essex town called Danebury. They describe their detecting sessions out in the local fields as finding junk and talking bollocks. Right, so they kind of just see it as this kind of quite low-key activity. And indeed, each episode shows them unearthing essentially valueless, or what appear to be quite valueless items, things like ring pulls from soda cans, toy cars, buttons, recent coins, that sort of thing, and then chatting together about television quiz shows. So it's this very kind of gentle, low-key sort of comedy as they rest under their favourite oak tree. But despite the fact that they narrate this to themselves as a very low-key activity, Lance in particular dreams of finding a Saxon hoard, which he describes as the holy grail of treasure hunting. The show cleverly intertwines their modest everyday hopes and sorrows into the ups and downs of their luck as detectorists. So when it comes to the question of this show as a screen representation of the Middle Ages, Detectorist reveals our need to have a taxonomy of representation that can accommodate the representation of traces and hauntings, again, absences, rather than the detailed immersive medieval world of screen texts such as The Last Kingdom. So while The Last Kingdom was this kind of very clear immersive representation, Detectorists, I want to say, is a representation of the Middle Ages, but it's a representation of the Middle Ages as an absence. Okay, so Detectorists is a representation of the Middle Ages after the Middle Ages, what is left behind for us to discover, to find for ourselves. I mentioned earlier that The Last Kingdom rests on the premise, which it successfully executes, that the Middle Ages can be plausibly and accurately recaptured. Detectorists conversely unsettles the idea that any holistic Middle Ages can be reconstructed today. The best we can hope for is remnants, traces, which speak to its presence, but also to its absence. And in talking about this, I just want to revisit briefly a taxonomy that I developed in the introduction to the Cambridge Companion to Medievalism. And what I want to say, that taxonomy was the made Middle Ages and the found Middle Ages. So The Last Kingdom offers us a made Middle Ages, that is a creatively realised Middle Ages that recognises the Middle Ages as an historical period, but also as a kind of a cultural category, as it were. So it gives us a made Middle Ages, while Detectorists highlights the found Middle Ages in all its incompleteness. The found Middle Ages emerges through contact with and interpretation of the material remains of the medieval past surviving into the post-medieval era, while the made Middle Ages encompasses texts, objects, performances, and practices that are post-medieval in their provenance and, again, imaginative in their impulse. And so even though the Last Kingdom is based on historical events, it's mediated through Cornwall's novels. And so it's a kind of a made Middle Ages. Okay, so to this end, one might wish to argue that Detectorist represents medievalism rather than the Middle Ages as such. But to say this would not capture the extent to which the Middle Ages are represented as an ongoing presence in the multi-temporal world in which these characters live. And this is shown in two ways in Detectorists, in the form of physical medieval remnants and in the experience of intuitive engagement with the past. And so I'll move on to explain this. So first of all, of the physical remnants that we find, so there are actual medieval physical remnants in Detectorists. The most significance of these and the most fully realised is the gold, quartz and enamel estel or manuscript pointer, which is unearthed by Lance at the end of season 2, which ends up in the British Museum as a temporary display alongside such other early medieval insular treasures as the Sutton Hoo burial goods and the Lewis chessmen, etc. The Estel's presence gives rise to the, and just before I go on, you can see here that they've directly modelled, the Estel on the left is the one from Detectress, and they've directly modelled it on this very famous 9th century Alfred jewel. And so it's what the show's suggesting is that what Lances unearthed is one of these 50 Estels that Alfred the Great is meant to have sent out to the bishoprics around England. And they've actually reconstructed it really carefully, such that it even has, they've reproduced the writing around the Old English text that's around the edges of the Astel. So, the Astel's presence gives rise to the show's most extensive sequence of actual medieval representation, or made Middle Ages, and that comes in episode 1 of season 2. Using a familiar narrative trope, one that's very familiar if you watch shows about, particularly about the Viking invasions of England, we see a Saxon monk hurriedly gathering books and writing paraphernalia and then stealing out into the night to bury them so that they'll be safe from marauding soldiers. The Estel holds this status of uniquely intact remnant within Detectress until the series' final episode, when the two friends finally find their coveted Saxon hoard. Interestingly, they don't find it in the ground, they find it in a tree above the field, where the birds have been gathering the Saxon coins and taking them up into their nests. So in addition to the Astel, which is that very important artifact in the show, we're repeatedly given glimpses of a medieval world that's sitting just under the surface of the character's modern world. And we have this fantastic moment of kind of painful dramatic irony at the end of season 1, where we watch the characters and they're walking away, and you can see them there in this screenshot. They're walking away from yet another unsuccessful metal detecting session. And as they walk away, we, the audience, see the camera crane up, and what we can see clearly marked in the grass next to them is a Saxon ship burial that they can't see because they're on the ground. And so we have this moment where the Middle Ages is absent, okay, but it's also present. It's just there beside them, waiting to be found by them. So, we see the characters continuously walking over this ground, unaware of what's beneath them. And this idea of the Middle Ages waiting to be found by these characters, Saxon England waiting to be found, is really marked in the song's theme song. It has this really lovely song by Johnny Flynn. And the song is actually sung basically, or it's presented to us as being sung from the point of view of these artifacts that are waiting to be found. And so the lyrics are, will you search through the loamy earth for me, climb through the briar and bramble, I'll be your treasure. I'm waiting for you. I'm waiting for you. And so it's from the point of view of these artifacts. And from season 2 on, what we see is that the opening credits of the show start with the camera kind of rising up through the earth, through the kind of layers of dirt, past all of these buried Saxon treasures that the characters don't know about. They're searching for them but can't find them. And so, again, we're given this idea of the Middle Ages, the Saxon period sitting beneath these characters, just waiting to be found. So it's present in that world at the same time as it's absent. So the Middle Ages are also represented. So I've talked about this material presence of the Middle Ages in the scene. So the Middle Ages are also presented as a presence within the spirits of the characters, and most particularly in the figure of Lance. He's repeatedly shown as having an intuitive relationship with the deep historical strata of his hometown. Although he manages not to notice the ship burial, as we saw before, of the local King Sexred of the East Saxons, just before he finds the Estel at the end of season 2, he describes himself as having a feeling about the place where he's digging. So he intuitively knows that he's going to be finding something here. His affinity with the spirit of the object is further suggested when, so he goes to visit the British Museum, and you can see him in that image on the left there, he's getting somebody to take a photo of himself next to his precious Estel in the British Museum. But when he later goes back to his metal detecting club and shows them a slideshow of himself at the British Museum, suddenly what we see is the spectre of the monk who originally hid the Estel. And one of the things that happens in the show is that the other members of the group can't see the monk in the background of the photograph, but there he is, shadowing Lance. And so Lance is kind of presented as being kind of haunted by this continuously present Middle Ages that he has this kind of attunement for. So, and in other parts of the show that I can't talk about today, he hears galloping horses, he sees glimpses of medieval people. So he has this kind of multi-temporal awareness of the Middle Ages, kind of its presence in his modern world. So what I want to suggest is, and I hope you can see that at the top of the screen there. I hope it's not being covered. Lance's Saxon-themed reveries are presented as what the German hermeneuticists called Einfühlung, which has been translated into English as empathy or empathic understanding, although it more literally means feeling into. The term is most clearly associated with such 19th and early 20th century thinkers as Robert Vischer, Theodor Lipps, and Wilhelm Dilthey. Although Einfühlung is the term most commonly associated with transhistorical empathy, Dilthey's favoured term for describing this process is in his most quoted work on the subject, The Rise of Hermeneutics, is actually Nachfühlen. And this can be glossed as a reflective re-feeling or re-experiencing, a kind of reflective experiencing of secondary feeling that is not psychological, but rather, in the words of Max Scheler, grasps experientially the quality of the historical other's feelings without simply assimilating those feelings into oneself. And so words like attunement, affinity, empathy are all kind of terms that circulate around this idea. And Lance is presented as a character whose connection with the Saxon past is expressed in this way, and he inhabits this relationship to the past. So these states of knowledge are not simply projective or immersive, but rest on the assumption that there's, again, this kind of modern affinity. This modern person has this kind of state of affinity with the past and a kind of a recognition. And that recognition involves simultaneously a recognition of proximity of the past in the present, but also a recognition of its distance from the present. So I'm wanting to suggest that he is, that we can describe him using some of these concepts. So this empathetic engagement is valorized very strongly in detectorists, but it's also lovingly mocked. Okay, so and there's a really lovely scene and you can see here Lance and Andy sitting here in the field together, and they're talking together about one of their friends who's also a metal detectorist, who resorts to dressing up in period costume whenever he goes out metal detecting, believing that if he adopts the costume of a particular period, he'll find objects from that period. So he dresses up in a periwig and a frock coat when he wants to find 18th century things, a toga when he wants to find Roman artifacts, etc. And so there's a kind of a gentle kind of mocking of the sort of extremes to which these hobbyists will go in order to experience this relationship with the past. Lance has a genuine connection to the past as a local man of Essex, and he's contrasted in the show against this very kind of sterile mentality of the British Museum. Again, kind of museums are shown to be the antithesis, and these are places where medieval artifacts go to be to have the life taken from them. And when Lance goes to the British Museum to see his Astle on display, he's really excited when he gets there. But when he comes back to see his friend Andy, he ends up saying to him, it felt like a wild animal in a cage. He felt really saddened by seeing the Estel in that museum environment and felt that it needed to actually be reburied and back into the soil where it can inhabit again that kind of and become present in the place that it was buried. So, okay, and one of the things that the show also does in looking at this idea of empathetic engagement with the Saxon past is it also contrasts Lance's empathetic, state of engagement with this shop that's owned by his ex-wife Maggie, which is a New Age shop called Crystal Enigma. And this story is just full of all of these kinds of New Age objects, things like fridge magnets of indigenous wisdom, dream catchers, shamanic sticks, this kind of thing. And it's presented as the kind of opposite of what Lance is about, because Lance is about respecting the singularity and the historicity of objects, whereas this New Age store empties indigenous, ancient, and occult objects of all of their kind of meaning and all of their connection to culture. And so there's a kind of a contrastive contrasting element within the show. And one of it does something really interesting too around, again, I think that Mackenzie Crook in making the show was quite aware of the fact that having a show where we're kind of valorizing this pursuit of Saxon treasures, that in the Brexit era, this can feed into, again, this kind of idea of valorizing the Anglo-Saxon past and presenting the characters as intimately connected racially to their long sort of national past. And so he attempts to sort of short circuit that, I think, through a couple of different mechanisms within the show. So one of them is that he short circuits nativist ideas in which Saxon treasures somehow embody truer and more native English history than other artifacts. Okay, so first of all, what they do is, before I come to this, I'll get to this slide in just a second. So first of all, what they do is the show is very careful to not just fetishize the Saxon past. And what happens is that characters become interested in all sorts of different periods of English history, and they're all kind of legitimate in their own way. Even when Andy, who's been collecting ring pulls from soda cans, that seems to be the only thing he ever finds in the fields, he puts together a display called Ring Pulls Across the Ages. And on the one hand, it's comic. On the other hand, the show is consistently showing other periods and domestic and everyday history as just as legitimate, legitimate a form of the past as something like a Saxon treasure. So there's a very clear demystifying and a determination to not just fetishize the Saxon past, even though Lance is so bound up with it. The other thing that's really important about it is one of the great scandals in the show in season 3 is when Andy, who's now working as an archaeologist, uncovers a Roman mosaic when he's working in a local field, and a corporation that's coming into the town actually destroys that Roman mosaic. And in the show, the Roman mosaic, again, even though it's a remnant of an occupying culture, the Roman occupation of England, it's still presented as a legitimate part of English archaeological history, just as legitimate as Saxon history. And so again, there is the show has been quite careful not to sort of fetishize the Saxon past. And I'm raising that also because that's a really important point of contrast with the dig. So the other thing that the show does is it's careful to introduce characters into the metal detecting society who are not just kind of Saxon, kind of white British characters. And so we have a couple of characters, Hugh, who's a British character from South Asian heritage. And also we have Varda, who's a character who's played by this Israeli, Moroccan, Romanian actress, Orion Ben. And so, again, there's an attempt to not just kind of create a kind of a racial continuity. I'm looking at the time and I should move on to the dig because that's my third text. And so the dig is a little bit different from the other two texts in that it is actually a feature-length film rather than a long-form television series. It was screened on Netflix earlier this year, February 2021. Again, it's based on a novel. Like the Last Kingdom, John Preston's 2007 novel The Dig, about the discovery of the ship burial and grave goods found at Sutton Hoo in Sussex in 1939. And again, we have another text where the representational idiom is absence, okay, that the Middle Ages is present, but present as absence, present as trace. And so I will speed up a little bit and talk to you a little bit about what I see as similar in this text to Detectorists, but what I also see as different from it. Okay, so So the text has so this particular film has a really stellar cast. We've got Ralph Fiennes, Carey Mulligan, a lot of kind of very well-known actors. And what they're doing in this text is it's about this unearthing of this 6th century Saxon ship burial. And it reproduces or it recreates the medieval past through this astonishing kind of ghost ship. Okay, so that's that absolutely key image of medieval presence and absence. And it uses a number of tropes that are already familiar now from detectorists, which is the trope of the basically the amateur against the professional. Basil Brown is our amateur, and he's the excavator who's come in, who's been hired by Edith Pretty, who owns the estate where the Sutton Hoo burial is. The mounds are on her estate. So he's an excavator, and he's pitted against the archaeologists, who are the kind of professionals, the institutional figures within the film. And there's another really important distinction that's made in the text, which is between the regional and the national. Okay, the metropolitan and the regional, and the national and the regional. And so what we have is when the ship is discovered, Basil, as a kind of a local man of Suffolk, is working on the ship, and then Charles Phillips comes in, and he's associated with Cambridge, and he immediately claims it as a national, as a find of national importance, and he demotes Basil off being kind of the person leading the dig. And the reason why I raise this is that one of the things that's really important for us to do is to not just fall into always talking about nationalism. We need to recognise that within the history of Anglo-Saxonism, regionalism has actually been a really important discourse as well. And Basil is very much a figure of regional Anglo-Saxonism in this text. So moving on, again, what we have is this introduction of intuitive characters, of people whose relationship with the past is driven by empathy, intuition, affiliation, attunement, all of those sorts of experiences. And it's not just Basil who experiences that, but also Edith Pretty. And what we see throughout the film are these kinds of tropes of intuition, where Basil talks about the past speaking. When somebody else talks about Basil, they talk about how he says the most important thing that an excavator can have is a good nose, right? That the nose is more important than the hands. Again, we have Edith talking about her feeling about the mound and where she thinks the treasures are buried. And so we get all of this kind of valorizing of intuition as a mode of relating to the Saxon past. And we get some really interesting stuff that goes on around the characterization of Basil in this film. So first of all, he's presented again very much as a man of Suffolk who has this long intergenerational familiarity with the materiality, the kind of Saxon past as a material past, and the Suffolk past as embodied in its soil. Okay, and he talks about how his father and his grandfather taught him how to understand soil in this really intimate way, so that he can tell you whose land, if you give him a handful of soil, he can tell you whose land it's from. And this mode of knowledge is very much kind of valorized and celebrated throughout the film. And then there's some really interesting stuff that goes on. And here's where we see some really interesting framing that goes on. So the way Basil is portrayed, the dialogue's really important in this film, and it's come from a novel, and the director is actually has had a much longer history as a theatre director than a film director. So dialogue's really important, but we do have a couple of very interesting moments of framing. So one of them is there's a moment in the film where Basil's in the dig, and the dig collapses, basically the mound collapses on him, and he's buried under the soil, and everybody has to dig him out, and it's a really frantic scene. One of the things that really struck me, and it took a while before I found the image, I knew that there was an image of a bog body that this framing was emulating, and I managed to eventually find Wenderby 1, which is this bog body from Jutland that was disinterred in 1952. And what they're basically doing through this framing is suggesting that Basil is this continuity that he has with the past is about him almost kind of, that he is a figure who has a kind of an atavistic, long, continuous relationship through this intergenerational kind of in situ existence that he has, that this places him to have this superior, intimate material knowledge of the past. And so here we can see the text using its kind of visuality to make this point about his character. I'm going to try to wrap up very soon. One of the things that I want to say is that I think the film, while I've been talking about the other two texts as I think resisting some of the kind of race, kind of nation sovereignty issues, or being quite subtle in their treatment of them, I don't think the dig is as subtle as the other two texts in the way it handles this. In particular, it draws on sort of tropes of expansion, particularly say Viking expansion, and has this kind of talks about quite a sort of benign image of Vikings as being like kind of space explorers, and a kind of a I suppose a sort of an adventurous image of the Vikings, whereas again within 19th century Anglo-Saxonist discourses of expansion, this was almost always used as a way of valorizing and buttressing discourses of English manifest destiny. And so the film, I don't think, is as careful as the other two texts, visual texts, in the way it examines that particular kind of those Anglo-Saxonist legacies. And I think in the Brexit era, it's kind of quite important that texts examine those discursive legacies and recognise that relationship with the way sovereignty and nation are being talked about in the Brexit era. So I don't think the dig is as careful. And the last example that I might use is there's a very important moment in the film where Basil's wife speaks to him, May speaks to him. He's gotten really angry because Charles Phillips has kind of, kicked him off the dig and taken over control. And so he goes home, and his wife, May, wants him to go back to the dig. And basically what she says to him is, look, your work isn't about the past, it's about the future, so that next generations can know where they came from, joining them to their forebears. And I guess one of the questions that I have about this text is what it means in multicultural Brexit era Britain to talk about the idea of Saxon forebears as though this is something that sort of is points toward the future. I think that in some respects, again, the film has not always kind of thought through the implications of what it means to have characters making those claims. And this speech of May's has given a lot of weight in the text. It's seen as a kind of a breakthrough moment that tells the truth about what Basil's purpose is in the film. So it kind of interested me that it used quite straightforwardly a trope of inheritance back to kind of Saxon past that points toward a kind of a future. So again, I would just sort of say, I think that one of the difficulties is also that this is not a long form text. So as a visual text, it's a 90-minute feature film. The other texts, Detectress is 9-10 hours long. The Last Kingdom is 40 hours and counting. So there's a lot more scope to introduce complexity and subtlety. And I think the kind of compression that happens in the dig is part of why I think it doesn't manage the same degree of subtlety, and its sort of ideological commitments end up being, I think, more limited than the other two texts. So look, I will stop there because we started a little bit late, but I'm coming toward the end of my hour now. So I'll stop and just say, I guess my takeaway points are quite simple ones, which are just that I think on the one hand, we need to keep thinking about a representational taxonomy that can include things like absence, traces, and talk about those as medieval representation, not just those immersive created worlds. Like, say, the Last Kingdoms. And the second point is just that we need to keep looking for ideological subtlety in these texts and look for ways in which we can continue to see visual representations and screen representations of the Middle Ages in all of their kind of complexity and subtlety. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Luis. It was very, very, very interesting. We will now give place to the Q&A, but before that, I will give the floor to Professor Gabor Planitsai. He is the head of the Department of Medieval Studies here at CEU, and he will give us a small introduction to the conference, which we didn't manage to do at the beginning for some technical issues. In the meantime, I will ask the audience if you have questions. please write them in the chat, and then we will ask them after Professor Planetsai's remarks have ended. So feel free to start sending your questions right away. Please, Gabor.
Yes, hello, Professor Darsens. Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. It's really stimulating beginning of the conference. I apologize to all the audience that I should have introduced you at the beginning, and I should have welcomed all the public to the Department of Medieval Studies here. We are very proud that this conference has been organized by our PhD students, and I must say such a big conference has not been organized yet by the group of PhD students. So we are very, very happy and proud, especially because the problem of medievalism is one of the issues with which the department has dealt with for quite some time. We had in 2002 a research project in the Summer University on uses and abuses of the Middle Ages. At that moment, what we were attentive to was the use of Middle Ages by post-communist East European countries, where there was a renewed attention and also a very surprising start of ideological use of Middle Ages, and we were benefiting from the possibility of having so many nationalities in our student body who were collecting their own fake or recreated or reused Middle Ages, and they brought this documentation to Budapest. So it was a very interesting, not only a conference with the participation of Patrick Geary, yes, but also a very interesting exhibition, which then was also presented in the Open Society archives with the title Contagious Middle Ages in 2005, which is still on the internet in the archives documentation. And then subsequently, my recently deceased colleague János Bak organized a big conference on the 19th and 20th century medievalisms, which is published in a volume. It was in a German corporation, and I'm just naming these things to say how much relevant and important is that now self-organized PhD conferences targeting this. There was also this exhibition of OSA was even taken to Berkeley, invited by the Townsend Center for Humanities there, Randolph Starn, and presented there. And also the Collegium Budapest and Institute for Advanced Study organized a focus group with Patrick Geary and myself and János Bak on medievalism, which is published with Brill.
Yeah.
Now, just after this brief enumeration, I must say that the present attention of this renewed production of medievalism on screen, in film, in games is really a huge territory with a very interesting interesting material for historical interpretation. And I was just envyful listening to the analysis of the detectorists and that type of sophisticated approach to medievalism. I will start watching this. I haven't been attentive to it before. But in Eastern Europe, actually, this is also going on a large scale, and not only going on the production, but it is in the center of political debates, the pagan Hungarians and everything. Unfortunately, we don't have that type of differentiated and self-critical and comic attitude approach to that. So I'm really interested now on the discussions, and I don't want to take more time. There should be questions and answers, but I'm really thankful for this presentation, which really shows the various aspects of medievalism, from ideology to sophisticated historical Einführung à la Diote. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I agree with you. It's incredibly impressive to see graduate students putting together something on this scale. Congratulations.
Thank you, Gabor. So now we will give the floor to questions, and I would maybe like to begin with the first one. And it's precisely with this idea of Anglo-Saxon that you mentioned. If I'm correct, it was maybe last week. I remember reading some news that there is now apparently something like an Anglo-Saxon caucus in the United States within some sectors of the Republican Party who are calling for the preservation of Anglo-Saxon institutions, not even Western institutions, but Anglo-Saxon institutions now. And it got me thinking precisely because, as you mentioned, for example, with the case of The Last Kingdom, with season 3, which you call the Brexit season, there is, of course, this character of Tura, which you mentioned. She's a Dane, and she's, at the end, dramatically killed in a xenophobic attack. I'm bringing this particular case because in the season there is also another character that, in my opinion, is very interesting, and she only appears in that season, and it's a Danish witch, which is named Skade or Skade. I don't remember. Well, I cannot pronounce it, but let's suppose her name is Skade. And my point is that, of course, the show seems to denounce the xenophobia around Brexit by the representation of the attack on Tura. But because of the very same dramatic needs of the show is constantly building the Danes as this existential threat to the Anglo-Saxons. And I think Skade in this case is very interesting because she's a witch. She's an overly sexualized character in comparison to Tura, who has like this more, I mean, she becomes a Christian, she marries a priest, she becomes quote unquote almost an Anglo-Saxon, while the Danes are still, I mean, it's like this dichotomy of condemning the xenophobia, but at the same time, the dramatic need of building the Danes as this existential threat. So then my question would be, like, how do you see this relation? For example, in the case of this witch, pagan witch, who wants to seduce the main character and at the end dies because of it, while Thura is like the good, it's like this, almost this idea of the good immigrant and the bad invader. So in which moment can the show actually like make this distinction? Because it's actually a very difficult distinction. Also considering what you mentioned is xenophobic on white people. But now it's not that they're whites, it's that they're Anglo-Saxons and Danes. So yeah, that would be my question.
Okay. There's a lot in there. I'll see what I can, what bits I can answer. I can see some great questions coming down the side there too, actually. So I agree with you. And I think this is, you know, if I can come back to, because this conference is about kind of questions of screen representation, I think there is that kind of difficulty also around long form, you know, that it's going to be really hard in a text like this to just hold a particular line. And I agree with you about the representation. I don't know how to say her name either. I know exactly who you're talking about. And actually the scene where she dies is horrible. And I think I would say kind of misogynistic, as well as, you know, falling back on a kind of a negative representation of the Danes. But I would also want to say that I think the Danes are quite positively represented, even though they are an existential threat. There's a sense in which they are, as kind of pagans and as these kind of hyper-virile characters and characters who are not kind of caught, sort of bound up by Christian morality, they're also quite kind of appealing as well. I think the show, I actually want to say this about all three of these texts, because I love Detectress. I absolutely love the show Detectress, but I actually think I probably have been a little bit easy on it in some of the things I've had to say, because I do think that ultimately the aesthetics of the bodies, the people in the shows, lead the shows, I think sort of are at odds on numerous occasions with the kind of ideological messaging, as it were, of the texts. So I think the way the characters look, the fact that the Vikings are this kind of existential threat throughout the text, but they're also, you know, to be banal for a second, they're also really good looking. They're also really attractive, and so there's a sense in which kind of the aesthetic idiom of the text is often kind of straining against its ideological portrayal and its narrative. So I think it's a really, I found it a really hard text to analyze, and that probably came through. I was finding it quite hard to analyze just because its sheer size makes it hard to sort of pinpoint. I think that's why I kind of came back to that idea that its principle of chaos is the thing that almost makes it closest to a representation of Brexit, that kind of sense of chaos and constantly collapsing and shifting allegiances is almost like the truth of the series, rather than any particular kind of stable ideology in it. So I hope that doesn't feel like I'm kind of running away from holding a position about the text. But that's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to read some of the questions. Vania, who is one of our organizers, she writes, "Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I have a question regarding the effects of this popular culture's representations of the Anglo-Saxon era. Do you think that such quote-unquote public debates have had a significant impact on academia? I'm referring, for example, about the ISAS decision to change its name to ISSEME. What is your take on this issue?" Maybe I will ask Vania if she would like to clarify or specify the question.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, the counter effect of these debates about public relationship with the past on then how academia should define itself. And for example, the International Society for Anglo-Saxon Studies changing its name to International Society for Early Medieval England and such. So I'm curious about your take on this. Thank you very much for the lecture. It was really interesting, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so obviously I followed that because I'm not a member of that association. I followed that, at one remove, but with a great deal of interest. And I think it's always hard when these sorts of really difficult and quite painful exchanges take place between people who have kind of believed themselves to be, kind of peaceably coexisting, but perhaps not understanding that other people didn't feel as that was the case. Okay, so I don't really want to get into that sort of side of it, but I think coming back to your the other part of your question, I think that I do think that it's had a big impact on academia, a really big impact, because I think that so our field has a very, very strong contingent of North American scholars, and they voted in, or their nation voted in a president that and the particular kind of government that they had galvanized the community. The community was already divided, but really galvanized those sense of divisions in a way where people, I think, no longer felt that they could, sorry, just to back up, that galvanization intimately involved the Middle Ages. I think it was just impossible for people to step away and say, this has nothing to do with us. Now, I'm still thinking through the question of the extent to which I think, so medieval studies has a racist past, or let's say its past is bound up with discourses of nation, and the sort of what would you say, the kind of foundation of various university chairs and professorships have been bound up at times with say nationalist organizations, etc. So the field has always been political. And I think that the idea that it's only recently become political is not sufficiently attentive to the past of our discipline. But I also think that the recent galvanization of the discipline has been, in some respects, symptomatic of the governments that have been elected around the world. There have been some, I'm living under a government in my own country that I don't enjoy living under, and I think that people have really noticed the fact that the Middle Ages has become a way, has become has just become part of the public discourse. And as a field, we've needed to respond to that. Now, whether or not we personally take responsibility in every single class that we teach for every single misapprehension that a student might have in our classrooms is a more fine-grained question that I probably can't answer. But I do think, if I could flip your question around, what would it mean for us as a discipline to step away from that? Okay, so to me, while it's been painful and it's been a real reckoning, I also think when we flip the question around and say, what would it mean for us as a discipline to say, that's got nothing to do with us? I think there would be, you know, there's a very significant cost involved for us to do that, cost to ourselves and a cost to the relevance of our field.
Thank you very much for
Okay.
a very thoughtful question.
Thanks. Sorry to talk for so long.
No, I mean, I actually wanted to add, I fully agree with what you mentioned at the end. One of the reasons why I ended up studying history was because I learned history through video games and popular media. And as you say, these representations of the past through media or in the Middle Ages or specifically does configure the way in which we think about the past and the way in which we think politically. And I think that as scholars who study this period, we have somewhat of our, maybe not an obligation, something of a responsibility to face the way in which this period is represented and used to justify these distinctive positions.
Look, I came to the Middle Ages as an Australian, and so the kind of historical events and the discourses that brought me to medievalism are colonialism. So I just sort of felt like those were the historical conditions that made it available to me as an Australian. So again, that's not something that I feel, you know, you can turn away from.
Exactly.
I can't personally. I'll stop.
We have a question from Tess Watterson. I think she's your student, if I'm. She was your student. Yeah. So I don't know if maybe Tess would like to read her own question.
Sure. Sorry, it's I will same time zone as Louise. I have no excuse. But I was in my comfy jumper. I thank you so much for your keynote. I was really intrigued by what you were talking about, this kind of valorizing of intuition and that valuing of the kind of intimate connection with artifacts, and that was kind of pitting the museum as an antithesis to being able to have a deep relationship with the past, given how important museums have been in a lot of the kind of nationalism and nation building. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more to that, and if there is something specific about this kind of Anglo-Saxon context that prompts that, or is it kind of a broader trend, or sort of a big question, but that was just so fascinating to me.
That's a great question. And, you know, look, the thing is, I don't know that I can answer the end of it because I haven't tested it out enough. That's all. Like the texts that I've noticed it in have been the two of the three that I talked about today. And they both have quite a similar take on museums. I mean, part of me, again, sort of standing back, part of me feels kind of anxious because I want museums to be continue to be funded. So whenever I see texts that start criticising museums, I think, oh no, don't go too hard, you know, because we need our museums. But okay, so look, I don't think that either. I think that okay. So when it comes to the dig, I think that there's a couple of different things going on because there's two different kinds of museums in the dig. There's regional museums and there's national museums. And so what sort of ends up happening is that two different museums are competing for the Sutton Hoo artifacts. The Suffolk Museum and I think that's what it's called, and the National Museum. And the one they're both presented as kind of ridiculous in different ways. One of the things that I found actually really troubling in the dig was the kind of association of learnedness in museum work with a kind of, I think, a pretty retro representation of queer sexuality. I don't know if you've watched it yet, but the kind of the idea that it sort of aligns scholarship with a certain kind of effete, you know, masculinity that a number of people have sort of pointed out. Look, in terms of the kind of nation building, I think that with the dig is very invested in the idea of embodied connection to Earth. And I think that's where it starts getting into a little bit of difficulty because it seems to be going in the direction of the idea of a kind of an autochthonous embodied relationship to the past that is kind of racial. It doesn't use those terms, but I think that that's sort of, the text goes up very close to those sorts of discourses. And so the museum just becomes the kind of antithesis space to that. And I think it's kind of it's presented negatively, but I don't think there's a kind of a reflection on the role of museums necessarily as nation building in any kind of positive or negative sense. They're just places that can take things away from amateurs. So I'll think more about it, Tess, because I think it's a really good question, but I don't know if the films go as deeply as you do. I don't know if either of these texts go as deeply as you do into the role of the museum, but I think it's a great question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Donato Cicaro has a question. He says, I have a question about The Last Kingdom. There are 3 episodes set in Cornwall in which Cornish kings and people are shown as savage, blue-painted, involved in nonsense struggle for futile reasons. Why, in your opinion, Cornwall is depicted in this way? Is this linked to the author's aim of describing the creation of the English nation, since valorizing Anglo-Saxon past has always ran through the undermining of the Britons? Do you think it is a modern, quote-unquote, strategy of distinction?
Oh, boy. That question, I think I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to that question. That's a fantastic question. And actually, I'm really puzzled by the Cornwall scene, the Cornwall episodes as well. And I know that a number of, I've sort of looked around and the response to those is general puzzlement, and also the representation of the Welsh. I've been wondering about whether the representation of the Cornish and the representation of the Welsh are in some way, need to be treated together or treated separately. Yeah, look, okay, strategy of distinction. Is it possible to get the person who's asked the question to say a bit more about what they're thinking with that strategy of distinction? So I
yeah, sure.
So I'm really interested by that question.
Feel free to unmute yourself, and if you want to expand the question.
Yes, hi. Sorry for the mute. When I talk of strategy of distinction, I refer to Walter Paul's definition of distinction between peoples in historiography. This is something very related, for example, about what Bede does in Historia Ecclesiastica against Anglorum, or in Historia Brittonum by the Welsh side of the struggle. So a strategy to say, I'm different towards these people. I'm different from them about some kind of signals, that is blue paintings or religious struggles, distinction about this kind of characters and features.
So I'm thinking about them as the Cornish characters as being sort of, that this is how the show is dealing with Celtic characters. Is that part of what you're thinking about there? Yes, the struggle between Celtics and Anglo-Saxon. Yeah, because one of the things I noticed a remark that somebody made toward the beginning of the chat session, where they pointed out that, of course, the Saxons were invaders as well. And okay, one of the things that I'm just trying to think about here. Look, I think the Cornish are just presented as completely barbaric and as gullible. I don't know what to make of it in terms of the kind of larger trajectory of the show. It almost felt like a set piece that you have this kind of the Celtic excursion where they go and of course, Uhtred gets to meet the very alluring Celtic, the Breton priestess or sort of shadow wife, I think, or shadow queen, who he can then deflower. So there's a kind of another part to the story, but they're kind of presented. My kind of immediate reaction to the way they were presented in the show was that they were almost presented. There was almost a kind of, I don't know if this is too strong, almost like a Darwinist sense that they just were too gullible, too kind of credulous and unsophisticated to really survive in this kind of culture of invasion and displacement that was going on. So as a kind of, if we were going to read them as, a representation of a sort of, if we can call them an Indigenous people there, it's a pretty unsettling and unpleasant representation, I would want to say. I don't know, would you agree with that, or would you?
Yes, I go along with you with this assertion, because they are always depicted as prehistoric people, something pertaining to prehistory, as the same of which they said in Victorian era. The archaeologists used to say to link the Britons to the Aborigines and the English, the Anglo-Saxon, with the imperial army going and civilizing the countries all around the world. So yes, it is a barbarian and most of all prehistoric definition of the post-Roman Britons.
Look, thank you for raising it, because it's actually not something I thought about in the course of things, and you've actually really clarified things for me there by forcing me to think more about it. I actually think that that they are presented as a kind of as indigenes who guarantee their own demise. You know, that would be that's my kind of what we call a quick and dirty analysis. You know, I'll think more about it, but yeah, I was quite unsettled by it when I saw it. Thank you for the question.
Many thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're almost out of time, so I will just read the last comment very quickly in case you want to respond to it. So Mateus Carvalho says, thank you for your lecture. This is just a comment about the Last Kingdom series. I didn't watch a lot of episodes of the series, but I have read the book series. And one thing that I find interesting about the books is that in some dialogues, the characters talk about how they are living in a decadent age of continuous war that have started with the invasions of the British Isles by the Saxons. So again, right. I think it links a little bit with the previous question with this idea of the Saxon invader, but also a notion of decadence because of the constant war of the country, which I would feel it also kind of fuses into this national discourse of unless we are a united England, we're doomed to perish.
That's really interesting because I haven't read the novels. I've only watched the show, and I was very daunted when I found out there were 13 of them because I struggle to get through what I need to every day. The idea of 13 novels, and they're usually really big, aren't they, these ones? So, but that's really interesting because I guess one of the questions that I would have then for Mateus is, are you suggesting then that Cornwall is, are the novels then saying, well, unified nation will solve that problem, or is it that this is the fundamental kind of state of England, is to be in this kind of continuous state of decadence, disruption, invasion?
Mateus, maybe if you would like to
you can type it if you don't want to
expand it very quickly because fine. We're out of time.
Yeah, I know you've got to run it. Okay, well,
or maybe we can ask him maybe to write you an email, like specifying his question.
Absolutely. Like if we're out of time, that's fine. I understand. But that's a great question. It's a great point. And depending on what Cornwall is doing there, it really changes the kind of nature of what it is he's saying about the whole kind of program of Alfred of Wessex.
Okay, thank you. So if any of you have any questions for Professor D'Arsens, you can find her information at the MacQuarie University profile, I believe. Yeah. Perfect. So again, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Luis, for your incredibly interesting lecture. It was really, really, really engaging, and I personally enjoyed it a lot. For the rest of the audience, we have our first panel in an hour at 1:30 CET, and the topic of the panel is going to be procedural rhetoric in medieval themed video games. So we hope to see you all there. Remember that the same link that you used to access this keynote lecture is the same link for the whole conference. So you just use that one and we will let you in. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you all in an hour.
Enjoy yourselves. I'm going to go have dinner.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.